Hello everyone. Welcome to the lecture on Culture and Encoding-2. This lecture is a part of your paper on Media, Culture and Society. In this lecture, we will discuss the critical theory from the Marxist classical approach to culture and communication. We will first discuss the theory of Frankfurt School, and in then John Berger's ideas will be addressed. According to Grossberg, both Frankfurt School and John Berger's work exemplify the critical theory. In this lecture, you will learn the socio-political background of the emergence of Frankfurt School and their concept of culture industry. You will also learn the critique of technocratic rationality through this concept. Through Berger's work, which explains the conventions of ways of seeing, you will learn how the authority and religiosity of art is destroyed with the emergence of mass production. Let us begin. Frankfurt School. Frankfurt is one of the largest cities of Germany. Germany has been the center of major material and philosophical advances in the history. This country has produced two historical figures who have given two contradicting ideologies of Marxism and fascism to the world, Karl Marx and Adolf Hitler. In fact, the historical emergence of Frankfurt School and their philosophy is rooted in these two ideologies. Without these two, you cannot understand the contribution of Frankfurt School. Frankfurt School is the name used for a group of philosophers associated with the Institute of Social Research established in the year 1923. It was affiliated with the University of Frankfurt, Germany. Tom Bottomer, a renowned British Marxist sociologist, makes a very important remark in his book Frankfurt School and its Critics. He postulates that the founding of the institute took place in the particular conditions produced by the victory of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the defeat of the Central European revolutions, notably that in Germany. The defeat of revolution in Central Europe, especially in Germany, forms the immediate background to the Frankfurt School philosophers. The second decisive historical event to influence schools' epistemological arguments was the rise of fascism in Germany. The failure of a revolution in Germany that subsequently paved the way of rise of fascism in Germany led the Frankfurt School philosophers to propound a hypodermic model of communication theory, although their theory is a very significant critique of technocratic rationality and capitalism, but it considered people as passive. They had no hope in the revolutionary spirit of the people, hence they postulated that the technocratic rationality of culture industry, which has generated pessimism among the people, which risks the possibility of resistance. We will come back to this point later. Due to the rise of fascism, the institute's members were forced to leave Frankfurt and take exile in America from 1933 to 1950. In 1950, the institute returned to Germany. So, the convulsions and destruction caused by the First World War, the failure of revolution in Germany, the rise of fascism, the domination and division of the world since 1945 by superpowers increasingly involved in a nuclear arms race, all contributed cumulatively to a sense of cultural loss and decline. Hence, you will find an aristocratic criticism of mass society in Frankfurt School. Hence, you will find an aristocratic criticism of mass society in Frankfurt School's critical theory. Hence, the critical theory which they developed during their exile in America and coming back to Germany in 1950 was overwhelmingly concerned with the mounting irrationality of social and cultural values and their reflection in the ideas of positivism and scienticism. A preeminent place was occupied by the criticism and rejection of positivism, empiricism, and more broadly of any conception of a science of society. Their staunch critique of positivism and scienticism shapes their concept of culture industry. The concept of culture industry is coined by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer in their essay. The culture industry, enlightenment is mass deception. It contains two words, culture and industry, which make the meaning very clear. Cultural products produced by industries, hence culture here stands as a commodity which is produced in factories and industries like any other commodity. The cultural products here stands for the production produced by radio, television, films, news, magazines, etc. According to Adorno and Horkheimer, the products of the cultural industry are marked by two characteristics, homogeneity and predictability. By homogeneity, they mean that under capitalism, the mass culture produced through these mass mediums is identical, which suggests that the culture industry produces standardized cultural products. And by predictability, they mean the formulaic pattern. For instance, the formula of Hindi masala films produced by Bollywood. And if one masala is hit, then all the other will imitate the same similarity. Similarly, the Hindi serials on television follow the same formula to Hindu joint family conflicts and restoration of Hindu joint family values. The commodification of commercialization of culture devalues the authentic culture. In its search for profit, culture industry not only homogenizes the culture, it also deprives authentic culture of its critical aspect. For instance, you may see the picture of a revolutionary leader of Cuba, the Guevara, in many posters. It does not mean an adherence to socialist ideology. Similarly, on International Women's Day, Mother's Day, many radio and TV channels, newspapers, magazines are thriving with messages on women. Does that mean that culture industry is committed to gender equality? Absolutely not. We need to bring the discussion on advertisements to be able to capture the essence of the whole story. Culture industry is intertwined with advertising, and that is why Raymond Williams characterizes television as theater of capitalism. The culture industry and advertising is merged and both become a procedure for manipulating people. Here you can see how Frankfurt School operates in hypodynamic model, where the people are seen as passive receivers. Adorno and Horkheimer argue that culture industry should not be explained only in terms of technology. According to them, the reason that technology acquires power over society to the extent of manipulating people is not because technology in itself has inherent power. It is actually the power of those whose economic hold over the society, and technology is greatest. This technological rationale for Frankfurt School is the rationale of dominance. In this way, their concept of culture industry presents a critique of science and technology. They were living in an age where the critique of positivism in social theory was prominent, especially in Germany. This was in terms of their social and cultural consequences. Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, in their book Dialectic of Enlightenment, hold the view that scientific consciousness is the main source of the cultural decline, as a result of which humanity, instead of entering into a truly human condition, is sinking into a new kind of barbarism. So, you can see how their critique of positivism is centered on the notion of culture. According to Frankfurt School thinkers, technology and technological consciousness have produced debased mass culture, This mass culture abounds and silences criticism. Marcuse, in his celebrated book One-Dimensional Men, argues that the classical Marxist concept of class disappears in modern society as scientific technological rationality takes precedence over dominant class. At the same time, the working class does not appear as opposing class because it has been assimilated and pacified. Marcuse's One-Dimensional Men is a philosophical reflection on the advanced industrial society of USA. It offers broad generalization based on the interpretation of American experience of culturally debased commercial radio and television. The underlying conception, which became a distinctive tenet of the Frankfurt School, is that the domination through science and technology necessarily gives rise to a new form of domination of human beings. Society produced itself in a growing technological ensemble of things and relations which included the technical utilization of men. In other words, the struggle for existence and the exploitation of man and nature became ever more scientific and rational. Technological rationality thus protects rather than conceals the legitimacy of domination. Matthew Arnold, an F.R. Lewis critic of mass society, suggests that mass culture or popular culture represented a threat to the social and cultural authority. In opposition to this view, Frankfurt School argued that mass culture produces an opposite effect. It legitimizes the authority. Matthew and Arnold see anarchy, whereas Frankfurt School see conformity. One side of Frankfurt School supported the growing emphasis upon ideology as a major force sustaining domination, and hence upon the criticism of ideology as a major factor in the process of emancipation. The other side was the analysis and criticism of irrational beliefs and attitudes in modern society, especially in the form of anti-Semitism. The criticism of positivism and empiricism and the attempt to formulate an alternative epistemology and methodology for social theory provided not only the foundation but also range of part of substance of the Frankfurt School's theory of society. Rise and fall of revolutions in Europe. Before we move on to the work of John Berger, let us look at the factor of rise and fall of revolutions in Europe closely in facilitating the evolution Frankfurt School. The revolutions in Russia and Central Europe were an outcome of the misery, carnage and privation produced by the First World War 1914 to 1918. As usual, the price of the war was paid by the peasants, workers and soldiers of the European countries and also their colonies. War produced a situation of wage cuts, rising prices, food shortages as the resources were diverted into war production. Before the war could end, millions of people died of starvation. And this led to a severe internal conflict in European countries, especially Russia and Germany. In Russia, soldiers joined peasants and workers to oppose war and demand more fundamental rights for their survival. Soldiers refused to follow their high ranks. Mutinies took place with the soldiers refusing to fight, shooting their officers and heading for home. The peasants were taking possession of the land. Slogans such as "Down with autocracy," "Down with war" were blowing in the air. Similarly, Bolshevik slogans "Peace, Bread and Land" were rising. For the first time in history, the working class took power in a modern nation state in October 1917. This is known as Bolshevik Revolution or October Revolution or Russian Revolution. It has become torchbearer of revolts in other European nations. But this did not go unchallenged by the counter-revolutionary forces, especially German aggression. The German counter-revolutionary aggression was so severe that Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, said, "Without the German Revolution, we are doomed." The counter-revolution in Germany had its reasons in the growing spirit of revolution in Germany. The reason was Germany lost 1.8 million soldiers in the First World War, but half of this number also died of starvation caused by the war. Food production failed because of the compulsory military services which stripped off labor from the land. So, there were hardly people left for agricultural production. Not only this, Germany had faced a naval blockade by Britain, as Britain is known for its naval army. This crippled German trade. So both agriculture and trade faced severe crisis due to war. In its bid to defeat Britain's Royal Navy, German sailors sacrificed on a vast scale. So, by 1918, German sailors began to revolt and resort to mutiny. They did not just sit tight on their ships, but went on to offensive, organizing armed demonstrations to spread the revolt through the fleet and the docks. Anti-war protests were on the streets. The city was festooned with red flags and socialist banners. So the revolution reached to Germany and German Revolution had begun. So the First World War had mediated the revolutionary action of millions of workers, soldiers, sailors and peasants across Europe. The pressure of industrialized warfare was imposing massive strain on the whole of European society. It had moved beyond Russia and Germany. Mutinies were taking place in other parts of Europe as well. For instance, in the year 1917, a wave of mutinies was sweeping across the French army. Soldiers refused to go back to the line. Similarly, in Italy, in the same year, thousands of soldiers discarded their rifles and streamed away from the front chanting slogan, "War is over, we are going home, up with Russia." The whole of Europe is filled with the spirit of revolution, complained British Prime Minister David Lloyd George in a letter to his French counterpart in 1919. The whole existing order in its political, social and economic aspects is questioned by the mass of the population from one end of Europe to the other. At the end of the war, the epicenter of the revolutionary storm moved from Petrograd to Berlin, from the edge of Europe to its heart, while the countries came close to resolving its tensions through socialist revolution. That this did not happen was to have dire consequences. The left's failure became the right's opportunity. Benito Mussolini's forces seized the power in 1922 and Adolf Hitler turned Germany. John Berger, let us know, discussed the work of John Berger, John Berger's pioneering book, Ways of Seeing, the based on the BBC television series of the same name, made in the year 1972. He was an art critic, visionary and prodigious writer who transformed the way people perceived art, particularly paintings. He discusses European oil paintings on nudity and examines the depiction of women in art. He argues that the way we see things is affected by what we know or what we believe. When he is saying this, what he means is that people will interpret a work of art according to the prevailing stock of social knowledge. This implies that people do not react to a stimuli mechanically. Whenever an image is presented before people as a work of art, their interpretation of the piece of art is affected by a whole series of learned assumptions about art that concern with beauty, taste, status, civilization, genius, etc. Hence, the social knowledge or what can be called collective conscience is already embodied by the image including photograph and painting. That is why he remarks every image embodies a way of seeing. For instance, whenever you look at a photograph or a painting, it reflects photographers or painters' way of seeing. But he always cautions that despite the fact that every image embodies a way of seeing, our perception or appreciation of an image depends also upon our way of seeing. He says that the relationship between what we see and what we know is never settled. Berger's idea of ways of seeing can be best presented through his analysis of European oil paintings on nudity. In these paintings, women were the principal subject. He examines the established criteria and conventions by which women are portrayed in these paintings. He says that in those paintings, men act and women appear. Men look at women, women watch themselves being looked at. This determines not only most relations between men and women, but also the relation of women to themselves. The surveyor of women in herself is male. The surveyed female thus turns herself into an object, and most particularly an object of vision, a sight. To present his arguments, he discusses three forms of image: paintings, photographs, and publicly images. The uniqueness of every painting was once part of the uniqueness of the place where it resided. But camera destroyed this uniqueness by reproducing the painting. As a result, its meaning changes, or more exactly, its meaning multiplies and fragments into many meanings. With mechanical reproduction, the painting can now be seen hanging on the walls in a house. Now, meanings multiplied. Each of them is seen in a different context. Because of the camera, the painting now travels to the spectator rather than the spectator to the painting. In its travels, its meaning is diversified. He resembles the arguments of Walter Benjamin. Benjamin argues that the aura of the art is demolished with the mechanical reproduction. Similarly, Berger says that the bogus religiosity now surrounds original work of art in art galleries and museums. For him, the bogus religiosity of the original work of art is ultimately dependent upon their market value. When he is using the expression bogus religiosity, he is actually referring to the rise of art galleries and university departments where a certain model of aesthetics is seen as the standard way of appreciating the beauty of a work of art. Art is now defined by what the art establishment says it is. Art is whatever art critics write about. Art is whatever art experts teach in the universities. Art is whatever is hung in galleries. Art is whatever art dealers flock to hagg funds. Berger challenged this way of defining and appreciating the work of art. He brought the question of power in constructing the ways of seeing. He says the real question is to whom does the meaning of the art of the past properly belong? To those who can apply it to their own lives or to a cultural hierarchy of relic specialists. The visual arts have always existed within a certain preserve. Originally, this preserve was magical or sacred, but it was also physical. It was the place, the cave, the building in which or for which the work was made. The experience of art, which at first was the experience of ritual, was set apart from the rest of life, precisely in order to be able to exercise power over it. Later, the preserve of art became a social one. It entered the culture of the ruling class, whilst Physically, it was set apart and isolated in their palaces and houses. But with the mechanical reproduction, the authority of the art is destroyed. For the first time ever, images of art have become ephemeral, ubiquitous, insubstantial, available, valueless, free. They surround us in the same way as the language surrounds us. The art of the past no longer exists as it once did. Its authority is lost. In its place, there is a language of images. What matters now is who uses that language for what purpose. This touches upon questions of copyright for reproduction, the ownership of art, presses and publishers, the total policy of public art galleries and museums. As usually presented, these are narrow professional matters. Therefore, in this lecture, you have learned about the work of Frankfurt School and John Berger. Also, the concept of culture industry propounded by Adorno and Horkheimer. The social history for the emergence of Frankfurt School and its theory was also discussed in detail today. I hope you have learned that Frankfurt School's work is surrounded by a kind of disenchantment, whereas John Berger's work shows that with the mechanical reproduction of the works of art, the authority and bogus religiosity is destroyed. Grossberg criticizes both the works for treating culture and communication as a reflection of economy in any society. He says that the critical theory assumed that there is an abstract process of the colonization of consciousness by economic industrialized forms which defines the power of the media. According to him, the critical theory collapses the distinction between production and consumption, while Grossberg is right in saying that these works did not focus on consumption aspect, but we cannot deny the fact that this aspect was addressed by John Berger. John Berger prominently brought this point in his work. He never merged this distinction. For more details, please read the modules carefully and attempt the questions given at the end of each module.